Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second installment of our exciting series with Ethan Marcus, where we are exploring the Sephardic chief rabbis of America. Ethan represents the Sephardic Brotherhood. I highly recommend everyone check them out and connect with all the amazing work they do. Thank you, everyone, for being here live. Thank you, everyone who's going to be listening afterwards. Ethan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Ohad. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me again, and special thank you to Habura. It's so great to be a part of this wonderful center of learning and education. And please God, it should grow from strength to strength. Okay, so I'm gonna hop right in. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, great. Everybody sees that? Thumbs up, perfect. Okay, great. So for those of you who didn't join us last week, this is a two-part series exploring the history of Sephardic chief rabbis in America. So part one, we were looking at the first Sephardic chief rabbi, albeit short-lived, Rabbi Nisim J. Ovadia, Rabbi Dr. Nisim J. Ovadia, a personal hero of mine, who was the chief rabbi of the U.S. under an organization called, that he helped found, the Central Sephardic Jewish Community of America. And part two, we're going to see what happened after his tenure, albeit short, only about a year and a half, 2 years, until he passed away, unfortunately, very young, under the leadership of the second chief rabbi, Rabbi Dr. Isaac Alcalay. So Sephardim in search of unity. This is going to be kind of a very, very important theme of what we're talking about today. Why? Because if you were here last week, and I encourage if you weren't here last week to please watch the first class, because it's very informative and I hope you enjoy it. But it's very important to note that up until the 1940s and beyond, the Sephardic community was very much scattered and not unified. Now, by Sephardic community, I want to place ourselves again by meaning Sephardim of Ladino-speaking origin, Jews from the Eastern Mediterranean, places of the former Ottoman Empire, Greece, Turkey, the Balkans, former Yugoslavia. So when they come here at the turn of the 20th century to the United States, primarily to New York, but also other hubs such as Seattle, South Florida, DC, Portland, Oregon, Los Angeles, they're very disunified. Essentially, they operate what's called a Landsmannschaften system. It's an old German word. Basically, you associate with a society, a mutual aid society, or a burial society, or a synagogue, based on the town you came from. And this is for Ashkenazim too. So if you came from a little, shtetl in Poland, you're going to go to that synagogue or that mutual aid society for help. If your family came from Salonika, you're going to go to the Salonican Brotherhood. If your family came from Izmir, you're going to go hang out with the Izmir League of Jews, who are going to help you out, etc. So these communities have a very, very difficult time unifying. They're very stubborn, in more ways than one. They don't want to cede what they see as both economic authority and political authority in terms of helping their brethren. And they don't necessarily see each other as fully the same. We referenced this last week, where if your family was from Salonika, you really saw yourself as a Salonican Jew, not necessarily as Sephardic. You saw yourself as Sephardic, and you had some elements of brotherly love for your fellow Ladino-speaking Sephardim, but you really didn't want to give up necessarily the political control and the monetary control over your society, especially New York. So we have this thing called the Sephardic colony. So we talked about last week Lavada, one of the Ladino newspapers, but there was a robust press in the teens and 20s in New York of many different Ladino-speaking newspapers. And these newspapers always reference our Sephardic colony. Remember, we're looking back to the old world, which still has robust communities. This is pre-war, World War II, around the time of World War I, right, before and during. Izmir, Salonika, Sarajevo, all these other hubs, which we'll see in a minute, they're all still very active communities. So they see themselves as a collective colony, particularly in New York. And starting around this time, you finally get some movement towards unification. There's a series of organizations that form as the umbrella institutions. So the first is then called Federation of Oriental Jews of America, forms around 1912. And if you remember from last week, Oriental is not such a great word. Even today, obviously, certainly not. But even then, Oriental is not such a good word. They're not choosing this word because they want to. Sheriff Israel and the Spanish and Portuguese communities see themselves as Sephardim, 400 years in America. They don't necessarily want to be associated with these rabble, these poor Eastern Jews who might be given a bad name. The name Oriental, and later on maybe Levantine, is kind of forced upon these communities. So they unify and form this institution, and for a little while, it gains traction. Different societies, from Izmir, from Rhodes, etc., all these different societies start pledging money and support. But then it backfires a little bit. It only lasts about 5-6 years. They don't get enough funding to really move them forward, not from the local communities, the Sephardic communities, and not from the Ashkenazim either, right? They actually go to the precursor of the Jewish Federation and say, we need your help, please help us. They go to large institutions and they say, no, we're not going to help you because you haven't proved to us that you can really manage this, which is already very patronizing to begin with, but really causes problems in terms of actual organization. But there's still this movement, despite the resistance, despite this kind of anxiety around unification, there's still this movement. So there's a couple other organizations that form later on. You have the Salonican Brotherhood of America forming in 1916, later renamed as the Sephardic Brotherhood of America in 1918. So that's actually my organization, which was really founded principally by Salonican Jews. But even that early on, the Salonican and then the Sephardic Brotherhood was really one of the few institutions willing to cede its authority fully and wrote multiple times in the press, the leadership, that, hey, we don't necessarily have to live in our own silos. We can be unified and come together. We'll even merge with any institution that becomes an umbrella and give our assets over. Then you have another round, Sephardic Community of New York, etc. And there's a big gap, right? It's either about a 20 years gap. And then we get to the Central Sephardic Jewish Community of America, which we'll get to in a minute. But I really love this image. This is from an early journal. They used to publish an annual journal in Ladino, actually. So you can actually see the Ladino over here in Merubah characters, and some English in the 20s and 30s for the Sephardic Brotherhood. And it's almost like a stepping stone, right? So you start with Sephardic immigration on the bottom, burial societies form. Those are the little Landsmanschaften systems. Then you have religious societies, those who eventually build synagogues. Then you have the first unified institution, the Federation of Oriental Jews, followed by communal movements. He's talking about some of these other ones I mentioned over here. And then the Sephardic Brotherhood of America. And the goal is community, right? This unification. There's actually a famous book I mentioned last time, Sephardim in 20th century America in Search of Unity. I'll mention it again later. It's a critical book in understanding kind of some of the gaps and failures. So like I mentioned, these are all the different communities we're talking about where they come from. Rhodes, Alexandria, Castoria, Monastir. Belgrade's going to be particularly important this week in today's lecture, which we'll get to in a moment, and the former Yugoslavia, right? So this region over here. And other hubs as well, they're all fighting. They're fighting over, oh, we should teach the tefillah this way. Oh, do we really want a Talmud Torah between the Rhodes and the Turks? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense, right? Like this is the kind of debates that are going on right now. And this brings us to Rabbi Dr. Isaac Alcalay, who becomes the second and essentially last Sephardic chief rabbi in the US. So he's born in Sofia, Bulgaria in late 1882, and he's from an illustrious rabbinic dynasty in the Balkans. I'm sure many of you actually heard the name Alcalay before. Why? Because his great uncle of his namesake, Chacham Isaac Alcalay, was a very famous proto-Zionist from Sarajevo. Very famously wrote extensively on rabbinic literature that he published about Zionism, about religious Zionism. He's actually one of the first people, even before Rav Kook, and even before Herzl, by the way. There's some theories that think that his uncle, Isaac Alcalay, same name, influenced Herzl directly because Herzl's parents were members of that community before they later migrated on to Central Europe. So it's very clear there is a direct connection between early religious and even secular Zionism and the Alcalay family. And it's a very fascinating family. His uncle later on eventually makes Aliyah to the land of Israel in the late 1800s and dies there. Certainly someone for a whole another Habura, but of course for another time. He studies at the famed rabbinical seminary in Vienna, which is very interesting. He actually does not go to a Sephardic yeshiva, right? He goes to Vienna, which is a very classic, high German Jewish institution. He also gets his PhD from the University of Vienna, similar to Rabbi Nissim Ovadia. Again, very Western. We're kind of shifting away with these two characters from the classic Eastern Chacham, although with the case of Rabbi Nissim Ovadia, he does go to yeshiva in the land of Israel, as opposed to Rabbi Alcalay, who goes to yeshiva in Vienna. Again, Vienna is this hub of culture and identity. It's basically what New York is today in many ways, and a dynamic place to be. He's then called upon to go back to Serbia. Goes to Belgrade. He's made a major communal force in the city, and the king of Serbia appoints him as chief rabbi of the city in 1908, and eventually the entire kingdom. And again, remember, this is pre-World War I. So this is before we have the whole destabilization of the region and the unification of the region. It's a very different world, right? Each of these little statelets are operating semi-individually, although you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire still there, etc. And then at the outbreak of World War I, he becomes extremely active in organizing. There's some really fascinating stuff that shows how direct and passionate he was about community organizing. Again, in many ways, he was a born organizer, but you're going to see later on, he differed in some key ways, and that also caused some problems in the communities. So World War I, he becomes kind of this ambassador of aid. So beginning in 1914, World War I, Serbia and Austro-Hungarian Empire go to war, Russia gets involved, Germany, you have World War I. The Serbian Jewish community is absolutely devastated, right? Serbia is attacked by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Russia also invades to defend Serbia. It's a mess. And it's particularly acute for the Jewish communities in Serbia, which is relatively small in the grand scheme of things, but still an important community. So the community leadership charges the chief rabbi to basically survey the state of Serbian Jewry. So go around to all the villages, see what their needs are, see where they are. I mean, the community is impoverished, right? People are homeless because of the war. Homes are bombed, schools are destroyed. There's no infrastructure right now, right? It's in the midst of we don't really fully understand what it means to be a country in devastating war, albeit it happens to be obviously that Israel is currently at war and we are witnessing some of those elements, and we pray for peace in Israel and safety in Israel. But I digress. We, thank God, in the Western world, don't really know what this is like anymore. It's kind of hard for us to comprehend. But he goes and does this, which is actually very difficult and very dangerous. He then travels to France in 1915, England, and the US to ask for aid from Jewish community leadership. And this is pretty extraordinary because he's trying to cross borders during a mass war. And by the way, it says from his reports that we're about to read in a second, he can't actually get back. By 1915, 1916, he's trying to get back to Serbia to help support, and he's stuck. He gets stuck in France and in Switzerland. That doesn't stop him, though, which is kind of amazing. He continues to lobby and push hard to find funding and find support from the Jewish communities there. Places like the Board of Deputies of British Jewry, the French Conservatoire, and the French Swiss communities in Basel and Zurich. He also acts, which is very fascinating, as a quasi-diplomat on behalf of the Serbian government. He, in many ways, is this fascinating rabbi diplomat. And he's one of the few people I've ever personally seen who kind of does this role. The other one being Chaim Nahum, who was the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire. We can get to him another time. But he's kind of lobbied behind the scenes to get governments to support the Serbs and fund the Serbs during the war. What do I mean by this? It's actually a very fascinating quote. We were able to find some archives that are reported from Belgrade in December 13, 1919. He writes a whole report to the Jewish community about his travels and a summary of the money he raised. He itemized this much from this community, this much from that community. And he writes this here. The sum that was later raised is the result of my initiatives and was collected because of who I am rather than in view of the general cause, meaning the fact that he was named chief rabbi kind of elevated his ability to speak on behalf of the community. Thus, for example, during a visit to an English Jewish family, I was introduced to Sir Herbert Samuel, Home Secretary at the time. During our conversation, I drew his attention to the circumstances of the fatherland. I just want to note, he's a very, very, very proud Serb, very nationalistic, very supportive of the state, which is in many ways a classic thing that many of these Chachamim did when they established themselves. They were patriots. I presented all the political, economic, and social conditions in Serbia, as well as our disposition towards the former Austro-Hungarian monarchy, all our suffering, and the crises that had led to the World War. He paid heed to my words, and that after a few days, when Great Britain organized an official reception in honor of Serbia, Sir Herbert, the first speaker, gave a brilliant speech, informed and well documented, in which I recognized my own explanations to the Home Secretary. This is pretty extraordinary, right? This guy's going out kind of on a limb here under no formal instruction or title from his government to lobby the Home Secretary of Britain, who, by the way, later becomes leader of opposition and one of the first commissioners not the first, one of the first commissioners of the British Mandate of Palestine. So clearly this man had an impact on this guy who would later become a critical speaker. And you can see that it did influence British policy, later French and also Swiss policy throughout the war. So fast forward a little bit, he returns, Serbia is devastated, it unites under the Treaty of Lausanne, under the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. So all of these Serbo-Croat, Yugoslav peoples unite under one kingdom, imposed by the Western powers, becomes United Kingdoms of Yugoslavia. So you have places like Serbia, you have places like Bosnia, places like Albania, places like Montenegro, all these small statelets under one country. So this new king, King Alexander, appoints Alcalay as the kingdom's first chief rabbi. He's already really well recognized. The government knows what he's done. And he founds a rabbinical federation of Yugoslavia in 1923 to unite the rabbinate into a central org, and then a rabbinical seminary, recognizing the need to train future rabbis and leaders of the Balkans and throughout the Sephardic world. And in 1928, he publishes a study of Jews throughout the Balkans. So he's, as you can see, he's an organizer. He's not just a chief rabbi. He's not just a charismatic speaker, but he's an organizer, a diplomat, and a rabbi, right? Keep in mind also, the title of chief rabbi is very much a political office. It's very important that he remain this advocate and this kind of representative of the Jewish people to the king and to the government. And he's so well respected that in 1932, he's actually appointed as a senator to the Yugoslav Senate, making him the first and only Jewish member of parliament in Yugoslavia, which is a pretty extraordinary thing at this time, if you recognize the interwar period was not always so great for the Jews. I mean, this is like wild to have a chief rabbi on the Senate. Like not even the UK had any kind of role formally for the chief rabbi in parliament, for example. And in 1935, he becomes one of the founders of the World Jewish Congress. So you see, he's very active. He recognizes the need for global Jewish unity and engagement and organizing, but he's also a bit of a pragmatist. And we're going to see this next. He's very much pragmatist. He is cautious about making large moves without backing from communities around the country or communities and constituencies. This is in contrast a little bit to Rabbi Nissim Ovadia, who also, as an organizer, was less cautious and more willing to push through, right? He was more willing to continue to force the issue forward through his charisma. And this is just really cool. I found this from the Jewish Telegraph Agency in 1932, announcing his appointment as a senator in the Yugoslav parliament. Apparently 30 out of the 48 senators were appointed by the king. So the king kind of controlled it quite a bit. And it's just very cool to see that this was reported. This was pretty big Jewish news, right? It makes the Jewish wires in the world kind of Jewish news. So then we fast forward a little bit to this idea of global Sephardic community. So in 1925, you have this World Sephardic Congress meet, this first Congress that we talked about last week. Many different rabbis in attendance from different communities, from France, from England, from the United States, from Mexico, from Germany, from Turkey, from Greece, etc. And it convenes in Vienna. Rabbi Alcalay is a delegate. Rabbi Alcalay, it's funny that later on and continuously throughout his service, he is active and interested in global unification of Sephardic communities, but is a little reticent from his speeches. This is from an excerpt from Sephardi Lives, and I apologize in advance, there is a lot of text here. But I thought this was really relevant to kind of get a sense of how he plays the room. So he begins. This is a speech he makes to the Congress. There's about maybe 120 delegates. We, the Jews of Yugoslavia, have special needs. Yugoslavia is their last sphere, is the last sphere that runs parallel to the Middle Eastern Sea. It is there that the Sephardi flow ends and Ashkenazi one begins. In Yugoslavia, Ashkenazim and Sephardim live together with strong ties. The Sephardim are the minority, numbering around 37%. The remainder are Ashkenazim. To this day, we have two central goals. On the one hand, we have tried to strengthen the Sephardi element so that our sons would be lost, so that our sons would to be lost to the Ashkenazi, would not, sorry, there's a typo there, would not to be lost to the Ashkenazi majority. We have been concerned with educating our sons according to our tradition, while on the other hand, protecting our values as a minority within the general Jewish population of Yugoslavia. Through various organizations, Sephardim and Ashkenazim have worked together hand in hand. So it's actually very interesting, right? because of the Yugoslavian kind of unification, Yugoslavia is this borderland. Ashkenazi are actually the majority now. And he's dealing with this in real time, which is actually a very helpful tool for him later on when he comes to America, because he's trying to find ways to collaborate with Ashkenazim without ceding identity. This is a struggle I'm sure many of us understand and know very well, being minorities within the American context. It's not an easy act. And seems like he's balancing it well, but this also influences how he wants to deal with the World Sephardic Congress. He goes on. Now, after the recent establishment of the World Sephardic Federation, we are not so sure how to respond. If we take the initiative and cease working with the Ashkenazim, the decision might not be perceived as an act of marginalization from a nationalistic point of view. Yet, from a local perspective, it could be considered a divisive act. We are perplexed and unsure how to proceed. So he's nervous about how this is going to play at home, basically, right? He's worried that the communities in Yugoslavia might not be so receptive to this. Like, hey, what about the Ashkenazim? Like, you're basically trying to shun us off to the side, which is something that it's very interesting enough. Even today, I hear sometimes when talking about Sephardic community, which I kind of laugh a little bit because, being the minority of the community, it's kind of like, well, there's many different institutions, but I digress. He also gets a little bit into Zionism now, which is also very interesting. I ask of the delegates from the land of Israel that they clarify their views on particular situation of the Jews from Yugoslavia. As we understand it so far, the World Sephardi Federation would be concerned with revival of the spiritual state of Sephardic Jewry from a religious and educational perspective, as well as our relationship to practical Zionist actions. For part of this venture, we are ready to join and offer all spiritual and material support for this endeavor. When it comes to practical Zionist action, however, we will be able to express our views only after listening to debates on this topic. It's pretty surprising, actually, because we generally know him to be a Zionist, right? We have extensive writings you're going to see later that he's very, very big advocate in the US for Zionism and for the state of Israel. But he's kind of wobbling here, right? He's kind of a little bit reserved on this issue. And in part, I would suggest that because of his political situation, political position in the state, he has to be a little more reserved when it comes to Zionism and the state of Israel at this time. That changes later on. Now, the question is who responds and who rebuts this? And it's none other than Hacham Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel, who is one of the representatives from the land of Israel. And he writes kind of beautifully about, like, why are we even here? What are we even doing? And this all has to do kind of with this issue of unification. So I'm just watching my time. Our exilic isolation tore us apart. It shredded us into pieces and turned us into divided entities. Alienated and distant communities, disconnected and detached from the great nation building project without any organic connection, not to unify us under a single public national leadership or to consolidate us into a national body. And you notice, by the way, Rav Uziel is kind of playing two cases here. He's kind of talking about the Jews collectively, but he's also using it as a kind of a dig at the Sephardim for not having a unified leadership, not being on the same page. So it's actually kind of a beautiful way to do it. With great hope and deep anticipation, have we always craved that the spirit and power of God will revive our spirits and gather our scattered bones into a national body. Who would bestow upon my hands the prophetic power to sound the horn of revival to all these communities, uniting them, consolidating them, and amalgamating them into one living party that includes all the communities from abroad? He's really referring to Sephardim, like he realizes that we're at a pretty pivotal crossroads here. Even 100 years ago, they were realizing this, albeit even more so now, that if we don't unite in a global system and a global network, we're in big trouble here to sustain our identity. So now we get to World War II. I'm at the cusp. World War II comes around. And by 1938, Rabbi Alcalay loses his seat in the Senate because of ongoing anti-Semitism in Yugoslavia, gains it back in 1939 at the cusp of the war, and nationally there's a crisis. Yugoslavia is quickly invaded by the Nazis and also by the Italians, Axis allied powers. They're overrun. They're not able to do very much. And Rabbi Alcalay basically has two options: to stay or flee, obviously. And ultimately, he's forced to flee. And he's lucky because he is a member of government. He has special privileges. He's able to flee with the king, the prime minister, and the government to form the government in exile. And he actually becomes one of the leading advocates for the government in exile. This is an image over here, by the way, of the Italian occupation forces in Serbia and Belgrade. marching to the city. And this is an image of the Yugoslav prime minister and the king at the time in London, making advocacy works as the government exile. But he becomes this advocate. And, we see this recording in 42 when he's already in the US. He comes to the US, I believe, in late 1941. He's able to go through Southern Europe. He's able to be smuggled out with his family through Crete and eventually Egypt, from Egypt to Lisbon, Lisbon to London, London to New York. So it's a pretty complex journey. And he records saying that although no synagogues or Jewish institutions were hit during the Nazi air attacks on Belgrade, Dr. Alcalay said, the Jewish community had prepared itself for the worst. We buried the scrolls of the law weeks before the bombs fell. All valuable Jewish records were being transferred from the centers of Belgrade, Zagreb, and Sarajevo. These were the pretty big Jewish hubs, into the provinces in order to keep them from falling into the hands of the invaders. So they knew already what was going on, right? They knew that as soon as the Nazis come in, we need to go into hiding, we need to flee. So this was somewhat known in some sense, although rumor, by Yugoslav Jews. And he goes on, unfortunately, saying that it was a really desperate situation for the Jews in Yugoslavia. And he arrives in New York just after the death of Nissim Ovadia. So in many ways, it's a little bit serendipitous. And as those of you recall from last week, Rabbi Nissim J. Ovadia founds with the community this institution, the Central Sephardic Jewish Community of America, in late 1940, 1941. The first one really to get the buy-in of all these different disparate leagues and societies in New York around the country, and he works diligently to pull them together. And it's really critical. But then, unfortunately, as we reviewed last week, he suffers a massive heart attack and dies at 51, 52. It's really devastating. And we saw the literature from last week from the minute books, how devastated the community was. I mean, it was heartbreaking. So Rabbi Alcalay arrives, the community is despondent, they don't know what to do. He's also arriving, I mean, it's extraordinary. He's lost everything, right? He's left the only place he's known as home, Yugoslavia, Belgrade, to come to an entirely new world. And yet he's able to quickly mobilize and get involved with the community. And within a year, the community asks him to be their chief rabbi because they can see he has a scheme, he's well established, he has global networks, and he's an advocate for Sephardic Jewry. And he gets very busy very quick. He doesn't just let it fall to the wayside. So first, I want to review the mission again because this was an important thing that we saw last week. And I really want to focus on one paragraph at the top when the formation of the meeting in 1942 of the Central Sephardic Community that actually Avi suggested I kind of explore a little bit more because it's very powerful language, what they wanted. So these were the different goals of the Central Sephardic Community: establish a rabbinical tribunal, a Bet Din. There's never been a Sephardic Bet Din ever, right? Organize synagogues, build a centralized Talmud Torah, build a Sephardic kashrut agency, construct a real unified Sephardic synagogue, and cooperate with other Jewish and local institutions. But this preamble is really beautiful. It says, for those of us who have been associated with communal activity, this occasion is very significant. It is one which will stand in our memory as one of the most important in the history of Sephardic Jewry. For the first time in all these years, we are here gathered today, representatives of all our Sephardim, so that in the years to come, we will no longer class ourselves as Castorialese, Saloniclese, Izmirlese, etc., but simply Jews, Sephardic Jews of America. It is our fervent hope that we shall know how to make the most of this historical moment, that from today on we shall see fit to commit ourselves to the success of the Central Sephardic Jewish Community of America. There is no need to elaborate on the worthwhileness of this great task that we have undertaken. Its very name indicative of that purpose. It's pretty dramatic, right? Like, the leaders recognize how they failed multiple times to unite the community to their detriment, and it's not working. And this is really critical. It's like this now or bust, basically. And despite the devastating loss of Rabbi Nissim Ovadia, they're able to start organizing and do a lot. The first thing they focus on principally, this is fast forwarding a little bit, but I'll just leave it up here for now, is war relief, right? 1943, the midst of war, they're trying to get Jews out of Greece and the Balkans. Rabbi Alcalay is working diligently with the Joint Distribution Committee, with the World Jewish Congress to advocate to the United States government. He actually writes to the White House, he writes to members of Congress, they lobby government heavily to help get Jews out of the Balkans, out of the war. albeit very difficult, obviously. And by even this time, it's unclear if they knew fully about the camps. There's some debating evidence about when the Jews in the US started to know. There's clear evidence there were rumors, but it's unclear if the Sephardic community knew for sure about the camps. There were only minimal reports. But even then, by 1945, the community organizes pretty successfully. They build a center in the late 40s in the Bronx, near where the Sephardic Jewish Center, the Bronx, forms as well. They establish a Sephardic Youth League, which is actually pretty extraordinary because it's the first time they recognize the need for a unified youth program. They hire an executive director and a youth director, so they realize the need for staff outside of just the chief rabbi, and they get moving. They start publishing this thing called the Sephardic, which is this kind of community magazine newsletter report 3 to 4 times a year, and they write extensively. And it's really critical. And for a while, it looks like the community is on the up and up. They form a Bet Din. They actually do it, which is really exciting. It's the first Sephardic Bet Din to properly form in the US. Later on, the Syrian community forms a Bet Din in the 50s and 60s as well. But for a long time, the Syrians also used this Bet Din of the Sephardic community. And he writes extensively. And he's really kind of this interesting unifying figure. And you can see how he writes also extensively as a Zionist. And this is an excerpt from the Sephardi in 1952. He writes, Rabbi Alcalay writes, quote, "The adversities confronting Jewry today in Israel and elsewhere are not unlike those faced by our ancestors. But Hanukkah is here," this is around Hanukkah time, obviously. "Hanukkah is here to remind us that Netzach Yisrael lo yeshaker, that the Eternal will again inspire Israel, lending its people strength and grim determination to cope with and overcome the grave obstacles placed on their path to glorious achievements for themselves and civilized mankind. Like Hanukkah, a restored Zion shall become a beacon of light, guiding the Jewish people and the nations of the world toward peace, love, and justice." He's very much a Zionist, but he's also very much a humanitarian, right? He's experienced war. He knows what it's like, and he gets active in civic politics as well, in civic society, right? We actually found letters looking for correspondence from the 47, 48, and even to 49, with Rabbi Alcalay and the Sephardic Brotherhood actually lobbying the Truman White House. We have letters from 1946 47 to arm the Haganah. It's really amazing. Sephardim writing directly to President Truman saying, you need to arm these people, you need to support them. Time it wasn't given. So Sephardim were clearly concerned about this and were advocates of community. And in 1949, there was this very interesting document I found that there was a UN commission on Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the first Arab-Israeli War of Independence that basically claims that Ashkenazim are the only one pro-Zionism, which is absurd, right? And this is a narrative actually we even hear today about, I don't want to get into politics, but anyway, and it's absurd. And so Rabbi Alcalay said, this is ridiculous. He works with this thing called the World Federation of Sephardic Jews, which is kind of the successor to the World Sephardic Congress, to write a series of documents and presentations to this UN commission saying, no, Sephardim are more Zionist than anyone you've ever met. We support the state of Israel, and we're going to continue to advocate for its existence. So there's very clear evidence that the community, by this time, is pretty unified around the idea of a Jewish state. And I want to point out again, you may have remembered this from last week, the reach of the Central Sephardic community is pretty broad in the early days, from the late 1940s through the 1950s and even to the early 60s. They reach communities around the country, right? Obviously, the largest hub being New York and New Jersey, something like 20 plus synagogues. But places as far as Seattle, LA, San Francisco, even the Midwest and Chicago and Indianapolis. And they even reach South America. There's correspondence we see that there were very serious conversations with places like Mexico City and Buenos Aires to form a yeshiva for the pan-Sephardic North American, South American communities. Meanwhile, as we saw last time, Ashkenazim is still not necessarily accepting us, and they still talk with some derision towards the community, even in the late 50s and into the 60s. And this is a crazy quote from Commentary magazine, which was even still around today, written by this guy, Leonard Plotkin, very Ashkenazi. He talks about the Sephardim of New Lots, which is a very big hub of the community in Brooklyn. There are several synagogues. It's a beautiful little, not little, it's a pretty big community. But he writes, quote, that their swarthy skins, strange language, funny pronunciation of Lashon Kodesh, and peculiar social and religious customs all seem un-Jewish. This is extraordinary. Even their family names, Alcalay, Toledo, Razon, which the Sephardim have kept jealously for centuries, makes them suspect in Ashkenazi eyes. Pretty derisive, right? Like, it's very clear that even in the late 50s, 60s, the Ashkenazim are still not fully accepting us, albeit this is when people like Rabbi Alcalay and even Nissim Ovadia, who helped found the Jewish Agency, are fully active in Jewish causes, in forming federations, World Jewish Congress, etc. And still the Ashkenazim are not necessarily accepting us. This becomes a problem. So what does Rabbi Alcalay say? We need a Sephardic institute. We need to build our own institutions. He already calls for this in 1954. He recognizes the need to build institutions outside of just one centralized community umbrella with some minor influence on local hubs. This I just found recently. This was fantastic. I mean, this is an article from the Sephardi Report in 1954. It's really powerful. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I really wish I could. I'll just read the first paragraph at least. To be a true Jew, one must have knowledge of the essence of Judaism. He must become imbued with the wisdom that inspired our people with self-sacrificing idealism, which enabled them to overcome all obstacles to the struggle to survive and preserve our faith and traditions, etc., etc. A Sephardi institution for Jewish studies is the only effective answer to this deep felt need to meet the educational problem facing our Sephardi youth. Our Ashkenazi brethren have long since put into practice this means for meeting the cultural problems of their youth. A problem embracing elementary and advanced courses for adults in Hebrew, Bible, Jewish history, and religious lore have been conducted with great success by the Jewish Theological Seminary, Yeshiva University, and other organized groups. There is every reason to believe that the Sephardi Institute for Jewish Studies will attract many of our young people eager for Jewish knowledge. This is pretty amazing. He's calling for yeshiva. This is what he's doing, right? Here in New York today, for the first time, we need to do this. To ensure the success of a Sephardi Institute for Jewish Studies, the encouragement and cooperation of the Sephardic community at large must be enlisted. We have no doubt that once this is so essential for our traditional survival, Institute is launched, the leaders of our organized groups, both religious and secular, will cooperate to help it achieve the success it merits. The rehabilitation of our Sephardi youth is at the foremost task. A suitable educational program, properly directed and sufficiently attractive to arouse interest of our budding youth, is the crying need of the hour. Let us then rise to the occasion and fulfill our duty towards our rising generation, thus further developing and preserving our sacred heritage. You can see the passion this man has. He doesn't stop, right? He's really working desperately hard to make his people hear him, because his people aren't listening right now. Unfortunately, although there are real leaders at the forefront, the unity is starting to fray, and people are becoming more American, right? A lot of GIs, soldiers, come back from World War II. They want to be American. They want their kids to be American. What do? They send big conservative institutions. They want to sit with their wives, right? It becomes a different kind of problem now that they become American Jews. So he's fighting this essentially assimilation. And even worse, some of them even leave Judaism, right? So what's the unifying factor here? It appears that the one institution that did unify the Sephardic Jews was the Sephardic Home for the Aged. Unfortunately, that was the one thing they could all agree on. We need to help the old people, because for some reason, initially they helped with the youth, but they weren't willing to fully fund it. This is a big problem. They charter an organization called the Sephardic Home for the Aged, which was actually very important. I don't want to dismiss it, because in the 1950s, 1940s, there aren't really any places that the Sephardim can go to live out their older lives, right? These are people, some of them are survivors from the Holocaust who miraculously survive. And they don't have a place they can be taken care of in their old age, and the community recognizes this. And they build this beautiful institution that lasts for about 70 years. It only closed about 10, 12 years ago because there wasn't such a need anymore in the community for it. But it's a pretty powerful institution, and it's one of the few things that all the institutions get behind. All the institutions fundraise, and they form it. They build it in Brooklyn, and it expands and becomes this world-class Sephardic institution. And you can see in the top left, I'll show you in a minute as well, This is the first resident, Elias, I guess his first name. He's 90 years old, accepting the key to the doors of the open building. And this was a pretty big deal because you have here Rabbi Alcalay when he's chief rabbi. I believe this is late 50s, but you also have Mayor Imperielli of New York City. This was a political event. Like, this was a very powerful community that did have influence, had political clout. And we have an evidence, for example, I just found out recently, the Brotherhood, for example, the Sephardic Brotherhood, fun fact, we had a member of Congress, albeit not Sephardi and Ashkenazi, named Schultz. He was from the Bronx, and he was a pretty active member of Congress and advocate for our causes. So there were significant points in time where the community had political influence, albeit waning. And just to show you kind of Rabbi Alcalay's role in all of this, you can see some other photo. This is the photo I mentioned of the mayor, but also later on in life, he was still active a little bit in public advocacy. This is Bobby Kennedy, who running for president in the United States in the 1960s. This is also Jacob Javits, the senator from the state of New York, a very famous senator. He was well connected and well versed in the politics of the day and engaging with and advocating for the Sephardic community. I've even found documents that shows he worked on a rabbinic committee and then the board of the Orthodox Union, right? He worked with the Jewish Federation of New York. He worked in the institutions to advance the Sephardic community. Unfortunately, he retires in 1968. He's pretty old. He's already in his late 70s, early 80s. And the community chooses not to appoint another chief rabbi. And when he retires in the late 60s, the Bet Din kind of slowly dissolves. I still have yet to find who exactly is from the Bet Din. If you find any evidence, please, I'd be very curious to know what this Bet Din composed of. But you start to see the community fade in the background, the Central Sephardic Community Institution. The community becomes less organized, less publicly engaged collectively. And by the late 1980s and by 1990, the last remnant of the community is the women's division, which is still very active in philanthropic causes, but by 1991, that dissolves too. So you see this dream kind of fluctuate, unfortunately. And Rabbi Alcalay, even to the day he died pretty old at 97, was still an advocate for unity and for this idea of this pan-Sephardic advocacy and organizing, even when he couldn't. So he dies pretty old. He lives a full life. He dies at 97 years old in 1970, I believe 79 or 78. This is actually an obituary from the New York Times that references him. He actually lived out 10 years of his life in that Sephardic home for the aged as its resident rabbi. And unfortunately, there isn't much talked about him, but there is still a legacy. This is actually his grave. I was able to find it online. He's buried in the Monastili Society in, I believe, New Jersey. But what I want to show you, and Avi kind of beat me to the punch, that in 2010, his daughter, Nahumi, who was the only child he had, establishes a chair in Sephardic studies in his name. To this day, this is the thing he is still remembered for. That even if he didn't get that Institute for Sephardic Studies, he still at least has a name to his Sephardic legacy, in that we still have a chair of Ronnie Perelis, who is able to honor his name with Sephardic history and culture and research, albeit not to the extent that Rabbi Alcalay wanted, but still to an important extent. So I'll close here, because I want to leave time for questions, obviously, but I want to leave with another Ladino quote that I thought was also really cool. Moshe Morio, Amonai Kedo. So Moshe died, God stayed. So it's kind of funny, but it's true. It's a little, I personally have gotten frustrated by how many times our communities have heard the call of unity from great leaders like Rabbi Nissim Ovadia and Isaac Alcalay, and have failed to meet the call despite the diligent work of these rabbis. So even though we've lost these chachamim and these leaders, it doesn't necessarily mean we're done for, right? We've struggled in the last 75 years, 100 years as a community to unify, and we are on a concerning path in terms of how we sustain ourselves, but it doesn't mean that we're out of luck, right? God still stayed after Moshe died. We still have a path forward, even if we lose these awesome great readings. And my hope is that these two series will inspire you all to get active and involved with things like the Habura, obviously, and things like the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, because it's only through community activity and involvement that we're going to be successful, that we're going to build future Sephardic yeshivot to train our rabbis, that we're going to build the great, Sephardic Institute for Jewish Studies, like Rabbi Alcalay had the idea of. We're going to have our own Sephardic Bet. We're going to have educational resources for our grandkids to know what it means to be a Sephardic Jew, right? And that, I think, is the most important lesson to take away from here, that it's not just about one person. It has to be a collective act. So I'll leave you with that. Again, I encourage you all to learn more about the Sephardic Brothers of America, shameless plug. And also follow us on social media as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions as well.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ethan. If anyone has any questions, they can unmute, write in the chat box, raise their hands. Wow, absolutely the main chat. Why didn't they elect a new chief rabbi after him?
It's a great question. The truth is, I don't know. I haven't been able to access the minutes from 1968, 69 after Rabbi Alcalay retired from the Central Sephardic community, although they are archived in the Center for Jewish History. I plan to go there at some point when I have time to look. I suspect it's a number of things. One, there were a number of active community rabbis who were more, let's say, modern, in the sense that they were from America, or more younger guys who were actively involved in organizing. People by Rabbi Abser Murciano, who was from Morocco, but was pretty young at the time, who was very well respected by the community and led a lot. Also, Rabbi Arnold Merens, who was a JTS-trained rabbi who helped form the Sephardic Temple of Cedarhurst. He was also very active in modernizing the community, albeit in some good and bad ways. And I should mention, the Syrian community did come under this umbrella for the Central Sephardic community. Their chief rabbi, Rabbi Kassin, accepted the chief rabbi statuses of Rabbi Alcalay. So I think also as the Syrian community started forming and becoming stronger in the 60s and 70s, they started looking inward to their own institutions rather than sharing kind of leadership and authority. And then I also think it's partially because of a lack of respect for the office, right? We're getting late 1960s. There's a movement in the U.S., very much a secularizing movement, right? People want to be American. They want to be less religious. The concept of a chief rabbi seems very foreign. So I suspect that the office and identity of the chief rabbi loses its luster a little bit, and they don't necessarily see the need to have it around anymore. This is all conjecture, though. To really find more, we'll have to do a little bit more research on it.
Wow, Jake points out that Rabbi Marciano officiated at his bar mitzvah, wedding, and the funeral of his mother. Wow, what a zechut.
Amazing.
We have a question from Elisheva. What's the proportion of Sephardi Jews versus Ashkenazim in the USA now?
It's a great question. The short answer is nobody actually really knows. The medium answer is that, and slash long answer, that there have been a series of studies. The Pew Trust, famous Pew Trust, does a study every 7 to 10 years, of Jewish life in America. They just did the most recent one in 2023 or 2024. I'm trying to remember. 2023, I think. And they estimated, and I actually don't think these numbers are accurate personally, that only about 3% of American Jewry is Sephardic Mizrahi. I don't think that's accurate. I think it discounts a lot of different identifying factors. I would suspect, this is really mostly conjecture, but it's based off of some data we have from the 1970s. There was a very, very basic study done by Rabbi Mark Angel on the demographic study of Sephardic Jewry in the 70s, and from immigration documents and studies that we have from the 20s when the Sephardic Jews were coming. I would say probably, between the teens and 20s, like teens, 20%-ish, is the Sephardic Jewish community in the US. Although it also, again, depends how you define Sephardic. If you're defining it as just Latino Sephardic community, perhaps it's smaller. But then again, you don't know whose grandmother was actually of Greek or Turkish Latino origin. They may still identify, even though they're only one quarter. Just as well, do you include the Persians? Do you include the Moroccans, right? This is a debate that demographers have in terms of how communities self-identify.
Whatever the number is, now that you allowed Avi to come to America, it's +1. On that point of how you define Sephardi, did they ever define it? Did they ever write about it, exactly what it is that they were trying to gather?
Yeah, great question. So bear in mind the mass community immigration that happens in the teens and 20s, and then after World War II, is mostly, and like when I say after World War II, 1940s and early 50s, is almost exclusively two communities, either the Ottoman Ladino-speaking Jews or the Syrians, with a few Yemenites, but really the Syrians and the Ottoman Sephardic Jews. So that's the community we were really talking about. Now, it's not until the 1960s that you start getting Jews from Morocco, Jews from Iraq, Jews from, in the 80s, you have Persians. In the late 80s, early 90s, you have Bukharian Jews. You started having more diversity, right? So at the time, they're really defining Sephardic Jews as those who, in a sense, have an ethnic connection, meaning that they can directly trace the lineage from Spain or Portugal to Ottoman lands, spoke Ladino, etc., Judeo-Spanish. The, I guess, Middle Eastern communities do come under the umbrella of the Central Sephardic community, although at the time they're much smaller. Right? Remember I mentioned the Syrians? The Syrians really had only two synagogues at this time, Magen David and Sharet Zion. By the way, they start on the Lower East Side and they only later on migrate to Brooklyn. And they, again, use the Central Sephardic community as the uniting force, and they do work with the community fully. They see the Ladino-speaking Jews as kind of the mother community because there's just more of them. And they totally support it. And, Rabbi Kassin speaks at, I believe he speaks at Rabbi Alcalay's funeral. And we have records of him speaking also at Rabbi Nissim Ovadiah's funeral, right? So there's very clearly collaboration. This kind of dissipates, started in the 1970s. There's a little bit, but not as much as there used to be.
Jake is asking if you can comment on the phenomena of several of the Sephardi congregations have hired Ashkenazi rabbis when their Sephardim have left.
Yeah, it's very interesting and in many ways problematic. I don't think hiring an Ashkenazi rabbi necessarily is a bad thing in terms of, a blanket ban on Ashkenazi rabbis serving in Sephardic pulpits. I don't think that's right. If they're a good fit, they're a good fit. I'm bordering on more politics now, so I'm trying to think of my words very carefully. What comes as a problem, and I've seen this time and time again, I've only seen one rabbi really in my life that serves in a Sephardic pulpit who genuinely respects the minhag makom, the minhag and the traditions of the community, and tries to elevate them based on their own traditions. By and large, all the Sephardic communities I've seen with an Ashkenazi rabbi, the Ashkenazi rabbi does not respect fully the local tradition, the tradition of Ladino-speaking communities. And this is a problem, right? Now, when I say respect, I mean they simply come in and they kind of slowly impose Ashkenazi minhagim. They slowly kind of bring them in. Now, that might be intentional. It might not be. It might just be because the Ashkenazi rabbi is uneducated in terms of the Sephardic minhag. But too often than not, it's a case where the Ashkenazi rabbi doesn't make more effort to learn the local minhag, to really help teach the next generation their own minhag. And this is really a problem. And like Jay kind of referenced, that's caused a lot of these communities to have challenges internally in terms of sustaining minhag. Now, it is not the only problem. Obviously, secularization is a big part of it. Lack of educational institutions like Sephardic schools is a big part of it. Discrimination from the wider Ashkenazi community is a big part of it. But rabbinic leadership means that you also need to learn the needs of your local community and respect those needs. And that's lacking, I would say, right now.
Avi points out that there's also a phenomenon of Sephardic rabbis who are more Ashkenazi than Ashkenazim.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a huge problem as well.
Yeah. Let us know if you want to remove the recording so you can speak freely. Elisheva asks, do we know what happened with the valuable Jewish records and objects of the Jews of Serbia hid outside Belgrade prior to World War II? Were they recovered?
Good question. I do know, so as many of you know, Yugoslavia after World War II is transitioned into a socialist republic, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So it is a socialist, quasi-communist, Soviet Union influenced country, although it is more kind of playing both sides during the Cold War. So a lot of records are taken by the states. Some of them are taken by other Jewish institutions. YIVO has some records in the Center for Jewish History in New York. The archives and materials, I think many of them are recovered. I personally have not been to Serbia, so I can't attest to the Torahs, etc. As well. but I know there are significant records and archives that were housed also in Israel. By the way, many were sent after the 1990s to Israel, to the National Library.
Mm-hmm. Were the Ashkenazim more successful in community building, or the fact that they were the majority, they sort of didn't need to do the heavy lifting as much?
It's a great question. It's a combination of things. So I mentioned this book, and I really encourage you all to read this book, Sephardim in 20th Century America by Joseph Papo. Joseph Papo was the first executive director of the Central Sephardic Community. Right, he's the guy who's organizing in the trenches with Rabbi Isaac Alcalay to get the community active and involved and doing things. And he's a paid employee, right? It's not like this whole model of volunteerism just doesn't work. So this book talks about it a lot. And what I've concluded in my work is basically there's three things that caused our community to fail. We didn't build schools, right? Sephardim did not build Sephardic schools to teach their kids. They built some local Talmudei Torah. They started to try to build the school a little bit, but didn't really formulate it. Two, they did face significant discrimination from the Ashkenazi brethren. There's no denying that. And if you saw last week, there's a lot of narrative about that very clearly. And they didn't receive funding, they didn't receive support necessary from the Ashkenazi brethren and recognition that they existed. I forgot to mention a story, I don't think I remembered it, that as early as 1917, there's a story about this Greek Jew, a Romanian Jew. He's 17 years old. He's walking in the street and he's hit by a horse and buggy and dies in New York. He dies. So the Greek Jews, sorry, this is 1907, even earlier. The Greek Jews go to the local Ashkenazi Hagadisha and say, oh, we need to bury this boy. He's Jewish, he's 70 years old, blah, blah. And the Ashkenazi Hagadisha says, no, we're not going to bury him. We don't believe you're Jewish. You're not Jewish. We don't believe you're not halakhically Jewish. It's impossible. So it's really awful, like some of the discrimination, and that's a very real thing. So whether or not financially this impacted, certainly I think emotionally and mentally this impacted the community as well, thinking themselves less. And the third and final, I think, thing that helped really hurt our community, was post-war secularization. When a lot of American soldiers come back, and many Sephardim, many of our members proudly served in the United States Armed Forces, they wanted to be American, right? They wanted to kind of push away many of the old war elements. That meant language, right? Give up Ladino as a spoken language necessarily, otherwise less with the home. Be American Jews. And at the time, American Judaism really meant conservative Judaism, right? It meant Ashkenazi conservative Judaism. So that really influenced their acts as well. And without educational institutions, it becomes very, very difficult to kind of push back on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. When they said one of their aims was to create a truly representative Sephardic synagogue, what tradition was that going to follow?
Yeah, that's a great debate. So it was going to be, now we would say it follows the Ladino Sephardic tradition, but the truth is, even within the Ladino Sephardic tradition, like all traditions, there's so much difference, right? Like, even for example, there's no one Salonican tradition. There were 50 different synagogues in Salonika, one from Aragon, one from Castile, one from Lisbon, one from Porto, right? Each of those synagogues, one from the Italian Sephardim, each of those synagogues had their own minhagim, right? And today we kind of lump them in because the community was destroyed. We only know so much from those who survived and were able to tell it and those who came to America before the war. So there was, even with the Ladino Sephardic community, there's no one minhag. The Rhodesleys have something different from the Izmaelis, even today. We don't know for sure. I suspect the Salonika one would probably be the most likely one used as a base, just because the Salonicans were the largest community who came to the US, right? It was just physically the largest diaspora community that established themselves. But I couldn't say for sure.
To push on this point, maybe, but and then we'll go to Avi's question. But let's say, when God willing, the community will establish truly Sephardi schoolings and institutions. So it's not enough to just give ethnic sort of to just to teach the ethnicity, or because the Ashkenazim can technically say, look, we can teach you Maran Shulchan Aruch, and look, you have the halacha. So then, or we'll have 1 week we'll do Sephardi songs, and 1 week we'll do Ashkenazi songs. Like, what's the big deal? There's probably something like a unique posture in halacha, in hashkafa, in service of Hashem that is unique. So did they write about that specifically, or did they just say like, look, ethnically, this is who we are. We're feeling discrimination, and they were able to rely on that.
No, they definitely had a unique identity, and still today. I mean, first of all, if you go back, let us go back. The whole idea of the Sephardic Institute of Jewish Studies, like he writes about this, right? He says that we need to teach not only the cultural elements, but also like the Torah and the education, right? Our heritage is sacred. And when he says heritage, he's just not just talking about like food. He's talking about Torah. He's talking about history. He's talking about minhag. He's talking about all these different elements that create this global Sephardic worldview, right? This idea that Sephardic Jews, and actually it's very funny, the commentary magazine article I reference from the 50s say that Sephardic Jews call themselves Sephardic and not Jews. They only call the Ashkenazim Jews because they almost saw themselves as different people, right? There was a unique peoplehood. Sephardic, it's fascinating. Actually, Devanar, I encourage you to look up Devanar's lecture he did for us a number of years ago. He talks about this extensively, that the Sephardim also almost saw them as different people because of the way we saw the world collectively in the philosophy. I think that for sure was what he was advocating for and what people wanted. It wasn't just about baracas and biscochos. It wasn't just about the music. It was about this all collective elements of our identity that are not being represented and celebrated.
Thank you. We'll close tonight with Avi's question. If Rav Alcalay was alive, what would he be most proud of about the Sephardic community, and what would he be most disappointed about? What would be his main call to action be?
Oh, it's a great, great question. I think he would be very proud to see young Sephardic Jews like you, Ohad, and like you, Avi, and others taking up the mantle and recognizing something needs to change and pushing back on this kind of what I would use Ashkenormatization or Ashkenormativity that we really see, and kind of reviving that classical Sephardic tradition to the masses, and not just to kind of older generations, but to young generations, and making it participatory. I think he'd be very proud of that. I'm very excited for that. I think he'd be most disappointed that we still haven't fully educated our youth, that we've kind of advocated that. Because he, like Rabbi Nissim Ovadia, would deeply, deeply concerned about getting the next generation involved, about sustaining community and identity. There's a beautiful essay actually I sent about Rabbi Nissim Ovadia. I actually sent it to Avi, that he gave at the 25 Congress in Vienna. It's beautiful. It's about basically, if we're not doing it for the future, we're not doing it for our Sephardic youth, we have nothing. So I think that's the deepest failure we've continued to have, and something that needs to change.
We'll definitely publish that in a Chabura journal at some point. It's very powerful.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ethan. This was very insightful and energizing and very valuable. Hopefully, Bezrat Hashem, we'll have you on many more times going forward, and we're very excited to be working with the Sephardic Brotherhood as well. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, everyone who's going to be listening afterwards. And Laila Tov. Have a good night.
Thank you so much for having me.